is Mark Spess, and this is a video on how to make brass tubing and lead wire armatures. And all the information that we have about these kind of armatures are from several puppets that we acquired from Wolverton Productions. And they used to use these kind of armatures in almost every stop motion film that they've made, including TV commercials, TV specials, and even a feature film. So there's not a whole lot of information on the internet or anywhere that I can think of besides my own webpage on these armatures. And they have a lot of features which were, you can see here is a Noid puppet that allow the puppet to be moved and posed, and that pose can be held, which is how you actually go about animating your puppets. So there's a lot of things we're going to cover on this video, and the first is where you actually buy all the parts to make these armatures. You can go to onlinemetals.com, smallparts.com, and McMaster. Places you can get all these the parts, and also the tools and the solders. And also, when you work with torches and flames and things, you want to make sure that you've got a good fire extinguisher, just in case a hot part drops into, a waste bin with paper or something like that and it actually catches fire. You want to make sure you have one of these. And also, when you're working with a machine grinder, or also rosin core solder has a tendency to actually shoot off little parts of rosin into the air when you're working on it with a torch. So safety goggles for maybe these cost about $2 and can save your vision, so it's pretty important. Okay, so now we're looking closely at some original armatures which were from Wolverton Studios, and here you can see we have a Domino's Pizza Noid, which is an actual puppet used in the commercials. And it's not easy to see how he's constructed because obviously he's got clay surrounding his parts. But this particular puppet here, I know for a fact, used a sheet of copper, really thin, for his ears, and he used lead wire for all the movable parts like his arm, and brass tubes to make the hard parts. And you can see what he would sort of look like. All these parts actually detach from his body. So his arms can detach, and his waist and his hips are all detachable. And behind him, you can get a clue as to how it was held together. There's small set screws, they're called. And those work by inserting a hexagonal wrench into the hole of this little part, which you can see is a little bit wobbly right there. And you insert that, and you can tighten the joint down to hold in brass tubing which fits into larger brass tubing. So it seems really complex at first how they're built. And this armature is a reproduction California raisin puppet armature. And if we look behind here, you can see, hopefully really easily here, you can see that there are brass nuts, and then you have your brass tubing, and then you have your smaller brass tubing which fits into larger brass tubing. So the way that these parts tighten down is by tightening or loosening these hexagonal screws. Also, you can see for the feet we're using brass sheets which were cut, and then they were soldered to the ankle pieces, which again, what they have are little nuts and set screws to hold these legs in place. So the advantage of this kind of system is if you're animating this wire here, which is covered by electrical string tubing, and let's say that wire were to break during animation, you could simply take a hex screw wrench and loosen this part, the arm would come out, and you can replace it with a new one, and hopefully you can save your shot. Here are some of the parts we're gonna use to make the armature. We have lead wire, as you can see here. It's just a gray metal, which is very pliable. We also have brass tubing, which you saw before on the armature, or the sample armatures, and it's pretty cheap to come by. It's only a few dollars for a piece like this. You can see another piece. And there's different sizes. The pieces can fit into each other, like this. We also have flat stock, which is this here is probably an 1/8 inch thick by around maybe 1.5 inches wide, and we have a bag of these, which are hex nut machine screws with a 4 40-inch thread on the inside. And let's see, actually I got these from Small Parts, but they have a phone number where you can buy these. It's 800-892-6917, and it's from Micro Fasteners in Lebanon, New Jersey. And let's see, 100 of these only cost me about $2. And also we have some 440 threaded rod, and what that is the number of threads per inch. We also have a nickel-plated, I believe they call these thumb screws, and what that is this is going to make a tie-down, and that holds the foot in place during animation, and it's a pretty integral part of your armature, even though it's a separate piece. And down here I just found a plastic bead, and I melted this rod into the bead by heating the end of this up with a torch and pressing it into the plastic, so it made a tight connection there. And that's just so you can grab the threaded rod from underneath the set a little bit easier while you're fumbling with this thumb screw to tie your puppet's foot down. We also have thread or lead wire, and this top wire here has a diameter of 0.125 inches. So 125 thousandths of an inch, I believe that's right. And this one here is 0.170 inches, which is a thicker diameter wire. Now, thicker wire can hold up more weight and more clay, so if you have a larger puppet, you want to use this thicker wire for parts that are going to bear the most weight. These are the final things I wanted to talk about for your armature. These are the set screws, which will tighten your brass pieces together and make them detachable. Okay, so this is a character which is just a preliminary sculpture. It's not animatable, it's just sculpted as it is. There's no moving parts. So this is pretty much what the puppet's going to look like. So we have some areas in here where we had to add our armature inside the clay in order for this character to stand up, and also so we can animate him. And we're going to have the brass parts where there's no bending motions. So anywhere where you would expect a bone to be, there would be a brass tube. And anywhere where you will have a bend, like an elbow, you have to add the wire. So we have wire which will sit in the shoulders, the neck, the arms, the wrist, and then the legs. We have a bend at the hips, the knees, and the ankles. So since there's going to be more weight, we're going to have the entire body here made out of clay, and most of the weight is going to sit right on the legs because the head is all clay, the body's all clay, the arms are all clay, and the legs will be clay as well. And the ankles will probably be under the most stress. The knees will be the second most stressed area, and the hips the third, and you can go on down the line. So that also what we had to do because of the stress in these areas is add thicker pieces of lead wire to the ankles, the knees, and also the hips to support all that clay. And since there's not going to be a whole lot of stress on the arms, those points will have thinner wire. And of course the neck, the head is pretty large, so probably some medium gauged lead wire will work in this area here. As a general rule, thicker wire for legs and thinner wire on up the line. And that's pretty much. Alright, so the first thing we're going to work on are the feet. And I have a piece of brass stock, and I determined that the length of the foot is exactly the length of this piece of metal in this direction, and the width is roughly an inch in. I just eyeballed it and marked a line with a marker here. You can see that better now. So we have our mark, and we have to cut this. And the best way to do that is to take a bench vise like this, just a small one, tighten that down in there. And now from where I'm standing, I can see that line is right about here. And I'm going to take a hacksaw, and you can just start sawing away. The other option is put your piece in the vise sideways. And this here is a very fine-toothed hobby knife, which is just made from a steel blade, and it's got some very fine teeth and a wooden handle, and you can stick it on there like this and saw this piece. And this will take you a little bit longer than the hacksaw, but you'll get a much finer cut. The final way, which is the quickest way, is to just get a Dremel like this. And this one has got a battery pack. It's got a cutting wheel, which is more or less a grinder, a very miniature grinder that uses some special high-tech glues and essentially like a sand material, which is flattened, and it's actually very fragile. If you were to drop this, it would just shatter. The good thing about this is it cuts quickly, and you can't cut your fingers on it. It's impossible to do. So it's pretty safe. You won't hurt your knuckles while you're sawing if you slip. So that's how that works, and you can see it's already cut into it fairly deeply. Once we get to a certain point, we can just bend this back and forth, and it'll pop right off. Okay, I got a couple of brass feet cut out, and they're pretty rough. The edges aren't exactly smooth or anything. And the other problem, see if I can line these up, is that one is a little bit bigger than the other. This one back here. So I've got a bench grinder here, which is another tool which is used pretty frequently in metalworking. And I need to take off maybe a 1/16 of an inch off of this piece of metal. So I'm going to just roughly mark where I need to go. So I'm going to take this hand clamp here, which is really strong, and I'm going to clamp down on this, and that'll hold it as I grind it off. The other thing you can do is you can take a pair of vice grips, and these are just your run-of-the-mill vice grips, and you can clamp down on your piece, tighten it down so that it won't move. And you can hold small parts into a bench grinder that way, which is pretty safe. And that's of course why you want to make sure your fingers aren't too close to this, because if your finger were to get stuck in there, it'd pretty much get removed, which isn't a good thing, of course. So I'm going to take this piece and grind it down here, and hopefully it will be successful. See how it goes. Okay, now this piece is still pretty darn hot from grinding, so if you want to, you can always just drop that in a bucket of water real fast, and it cools off instantly. But these pieces are about the same size now, and just need some final refining with a hand file. So this is a hand file, and all you have to do to fix these up is to just go over them like this, get any sharp edges off. And there we go. Okay, so now it's time to make the feet, and there are different ways to tie the feet down to your set. As you can see here, on our California Raisin puppet, we've got a set screw holding the foot down so that we can move his body around, but his foot stays firmly planted. We sell these on our site. What this is a hex screw, and you first drill a hole into your set with a 9/64 inch drill bit, and then you stick this into the hole and tighten it down. The other way is to simply just take a wood screw and screw it down right over the foot like this. Now you don't need to have an actual groove cut into the foot. You can actually just have a hole for the screw to fit into. And the final way is to use a tie down, which goes and physically screws into the brass foot itself. And you cut threads, the actual thread here, but you would actually do the opposite of that into the brass using a tap, I guess it's just a tap set here. And what that involves is two pieces that you buy in a hardware store, and one part is the drill and one part is the tap which cuts the threads. So this is a 4-40 inch NC number 43 tap and drill set. So we had to do some thinking about how we're going to make this the ankle piece that goes onto our foot. So we found the proper diameter of our brass tubing, the square type, which will fit into our lead wire, and we'll solder that down. And we also had to figure out a corresponding piece to fit into that, which we'll use later on when we attach the entire piece to the hip section of our armature. So the next thing we have to do is figure out where do we want the ankle to fit into the foot. In the drawing, I've got it at the very end, like this. So now that we know how much space we have outside of that area, we can figure out where we can start drilling our holes into our piece of brass stock which makes up the foot. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate how to use a tap and die set to cut the threads into this piece of stock. And I also want to drill a hole so that I also have the option of putting a screw through this foot, which gives me more flexibility. So I'm going to mark off 2 spots. One where we'll drill the hole for the tap, and one for putting a hole to attach using a screw, about right there. And I'll just eyeball it and get them both about the same. You know where we had to drill some holes. The first one will be where we drill for our tap to cut the threads, and the second holes will be for our screws. So we're taking a center punch, which is just a pointed piece of metal. You can use a nail or any sharp object which is round and comes to a point. So if you have a piece of steel dowel rod, you can just sharpen the tip and stick it where you want to drill the hole and hit it with a hammer. Do the same with the other ones. Okay, and what that does is it creates a dimple where our drill, when we come in with the drill press, it'll go right in there and it won't slip. So that way you get a precise cut exactly where you want it. Our foot, our brass foot, and put it into a vise here. Let's see if I can back off a bit. Now this vise is specifically for drill presses, and it sits on the base of our drill press, and you can screw this down if you want to, but for this small piece I'm not too worried about it popping off or slipping, so I'm just going to move it around by hand. I've got a drill bit which corresponds to the tap, like I mentioned before. So the specific drill bit width will work with this particular tap. And we're going to drill this, and we're going to do the same thing to the other one where we've marked it and with a dimple. And before I cut this, I'm going to take some tap magic, and what this does is it just cuts down on the friction and the heat of this particular drill bit going into the brass. So just put a drop on there. Set my camera up here again. Okay. So there we go, we got a hole. That's not the most precise way of doing things, but it works. And what we'll do is we'll do the same thing to the other foot, and then we'll cut a larger hole, maybe about, I'd say 1/8 inch, right into the second dimple that we made before, so we can insert a screw through that hole. And then we'll go ahead and tap this. Okay, so I drilled some holes. I got our small hole for the tap and the large hole to insert a screw through, and I actually went with the 3/16 of an inch drill bit for the larger ones, and it left what are known as burrs, and these are just pieces of metal which weren't cut. I'm just going to take a knife here and remove that carefully, hopefully. So that gets the larger chunks off, and I can take either a hand file and file this like this, and flatten those burrs off. The other thing I can do is I can take a grinding attachment on this Dremel and just grind it. So the next step is to take the foot, put it in a nice strong clamp so that you can't move it no matter how hard you try. It's really sturdy. We're going to take our tap magic again, put a drop right in that hole, and our tap has small threads out of a very strong carbon steel, so it is about the hardest steel you can get, and it will cut threads as we twist it into this small hole, because brass is a much softer steel, well, not steel but metal. I'll get this thing lined up better here. So you want to try and keep it as straight as possible. Twist real slow. Periodically you want to go in reverse to break the actual brass chips that are created by those little threads, the cutting threads. So if you feel it getting stuck, you just want to kind of back off a little. Just twist it right in there. Now it's all the way through, so I'm just going to reverse it. When I pull it out, you can see that there's little pieces of brass. Just going to blow that out of there. And to test to see if this is going to work with our tie down that I showed you before, I'm just going to screw that into that hole. And it works. The only problem is it's a tiny bit loose. As you can see, I can wobble it, but I've never had any problems in the past where that's been the case. So that's not a problem at all. So we'll just remove that all the way, and we'll repeat that with the other foot. Okay, so I've taken both feet and I've put some holes, tapped them, and I've also rounded the edges, as you can see. These edges are nice and round and more like a foot. And I've also taken some 600 grit sandpaper and I've sanded these down. And that's just to rough them up and get rid of some of the oils and things on there that are applied during the process of making these particular pieces of brass. So the next step we have to do is to attach some ankles, and we're going to use some square brass tubing, and we have to figure out how high do we want that piece to stick off of the foot there. So I'm going to guess that it's going to be somewhere around here. I'm going to mark it. So now we know roughly where to cut this piece. Okay, so I've taken the brass tubing and I put it into this vise, and we have to cut this. So what I'm going to show is, now we've got our hacksaw, and all you have to do to cut this is go back and forth just like you were sawing a piece of wood. Put your finger there to make sure it doesn't slip. And you'll notice when you get to a certain point with the hacksaw, the blade sticks, and that's because you have, after you cut through the top part, you have two side pieces which are sticking up, and they catch onto the teeth of the blade. So you want to turn the hacksaw around and hold it backwards and pull it towards you. And what that does, for whatever reason, and it doesn't want to work. It usually works. There we go. So by turning the hacksaw blade around, it makes it a little easier for the teeth to grip on there. So I'm just going to grab it with some pliers so I don't lose the piece. And there it is. So what we're left with is sort of a very rough piece, as you can see. That's going to require some more filing, so I'll just hold the piece like this in my pliers and just have a go at it. Okay. So that's how that will sit on the foot. This looks pretty good. And so we'll repeat the same process by taking the piece that we just cut and laying it on the other piece. And I'm going to mark it so it's slightly a bit larger. And the reason for this is so that when I file the bottom part off to smooth out that cut on this piece, they'll be about the same size. And now I'm going to take the finer knife that I showed you earlier, the finer saw, and I'm going to cut the second piece. And when you cut these, it's always better to cut them slightly larger, because that way you can always file them down later on if they're too large. But if you cut a piece like this too short, it's pretty difficult to make it larger in any way. So as you can see with the finer tooth saw, it also gets stuck. And what you have to do is twist it in the vise like this. And line it up with the first cut. Until it sticks. And for this cut, line up the two cuts, you can see them right there and there, with your blade. Grab it with some pliers. Okay. So there's the second piece. As you can see, it's a little bit larger, which is fine. That's actually better. And what I'll do is I'll hand file these down so that they're exactly the same size, and then we'll talk about soldering. So we're about to solder, and there's a lot of things we have to set up before we can actually get to work here. And you can see here we have a lighter. We have our ruby flux. We have some lead-free Dutch boy rosin core solder. And a lot of people say, well, you don't need to use rosin core, and that's true because we have the flux that we'll be using. But it's just sort of like an extra touch, you know, makes it a lot easier for you to for that lead to or the solder to adhere to your parts. Let's see, we have this here, which is a propane canister for camping, propane fuel, and what we have on the top is a nozzle. And this here you can find in hardware stores or any place that sells welding equipment or plumbing supplies. And you can get one of these for about $7. It has a little nozzle which turns on and off and allows the propane to come through this piece here. And when it gets to this point where these holes are, you can see through there, the propane comes up, mixes with air, and comes out the tip as a flame. So propane and air, just plain old oxygen from the atmosphere, is what actually creates a propane fire, hot enough to melt our solder, and that's pretty much the basics. What I have here, this particular type of flux, is ruby flux, and it's actually more or less used for copper, but I found that it works great for brass too, so that's why I like to use it. And the way that I apply it is I take a piece of aluminum wire, dip it down inside, pull it out, and apply it to the parts. So there's no pouring, there's no mess, anything like that. The next thing is, if you can find a jewelry shop, what we have is this sort of charcoal-y kind of material. It's super lightweight, and you can see it's been used probably about 1,000 times, so it's pretty dirty. This particular stuff is just a heat shielding material that you can get in jewelry shops. Most places that repair rings and such will use these to lay their rings onto so that you don't burn the table. Other things you can use for this are plain old bricks, and that's pretty much it. A good brick or special material like this from a jewelry shop, and by the way, they can special order these as well. They're just a heat shield rock. That's pretty much the only thing I can think of that is really good for this type of work. The other option, of course, is to just take something like this clamp here, table clamp, close it up, sit your parts on it like this, and heat it up. The main problem with this is that anytime you have a large piece of metal and you're working on a smaller piece of metal like this, which is resting on it, any heat that you apply to the brass will go straight into the steel. So that basically means it would take you about 10 times as long to heat up this piece of brass sitting on this steel as opposed to one of these fire bricks. So it's important to think about how you're going to set your parts up securely before heating them. Another thing you can do if you want to be even safer is to apply some aluminum foil to parts around the objects you're heating. And also the final safety thing I want to talk about is if I'm heating a part up here, when I were to knock it off the table, it's going to land on whatever is below, and so you don't want to put like a garbage pail there or any kind of papers or a carpet or anything like that. So now we want to solder these two parts together, and we have a square piece and the flat piece, and we have to control where the solder flows. And the way we do this is we want to apply some flux right in the area where we want the solder to go. So I'm going to place that on top. Move these two parts around a little bit here. So now I know that flux is coating the entire part between where these two parts connect. So I'm going to start cutting little pieces of solder, just a little piece. I'm going to lay it right here. And cut another piece. Lay it right here. So now I've got solder on both sides of this part. I'm going to center this brass piece right about there. And when I heat this, if all goes well, that solder will melt right around the entire edge of these two parts. So I want to light the tip of our propane torch. I'm going to turn it on. Adjust the flame so it's not all that strong. It doesn't have to be all that hot for this to work. I'm going to start to heat the larger foot area first because you want for the temperature of the large piece and the small piece to be the same, so that when the solder starts to flow, it will stick to both parts. If one part is cold and the other part really hot, the solder will stick to the hottest part and not the cold one. So you can see the flux starts to evaporate and boil off. Oops. And as soon as this thing starts to get hot, you'll see that rosin core solder just kind of flow in there. And so if it kind of beads up on one side or something, you can heat the side and it should flow in that direction. But you don't want to overheat it. Okay, here's the second foot. And I've zoomed in just so you can see in detail how this works. Apply some flux, like this. Just a drop or so. And only where you want the solder to flow into the part. I'm going to lay my piece on top. Make sure that that lower edge is coated. Sit it in place. Cut a small piece of solder. Set it down on your piece. Put another piece behind it. If you wanted to, you could, of course, put little pieces on all four sides. And if you remember, I sanded the whole foot with some 600 grit sandpaper to rough that up so that when the solder does flow, there's some grip to the metal. Okay, so the parts are lined up. I got solder on both sides, flux. Pieces are lined up pretty good. I'm lighting my propane torch. Adjust it. Start to heat up the foot first. Keep the flame moving as well. You don't want to heat up one spot too much. Flux is boiling off. And once the parts start to reach a certain temperature, see that solder just flow right in there, hopefully. Turn your flame off. While it's still warm, you can adjust it sometimes. So if it's off, or the boiling action of the flux moves the part, you can get it in the right spot. And then we'll grab it with some pliers. Pull it off. Yes. Alright. So we got our part. soldered. And grab it. Try to break it off. If there's any problems, you want to make sure they happen now and not while you're animating. So, okay, it's time to talk about some limitations of lead wire armatures. I've taken my drawing of our character, which was printed out to the same scale that I wanted the armature to be made, and I'm setting it up here like this. And you can see the legs are really short. You can see they'll end somewhere around here where the next part will plug in. And they're only about, let's see, somewhere around 1 3/4 inches or so. So why is this a problem? Now if we wanted to make this puppet walk after we apply the clay, we'd have to add some hard areas using more brass tubing from around here to here, and then this area would be bendable, and then from here to here we'd have to have another hard piece of brass tubing for those parts not to bend as the leg bends. So where we want the bend to be for a knee would have to be around here, and that's a very narrow area. So with any kind of lead wire, there are some rules you got to follow, and basically the thicker the wire is, the further the gap will have to be between two parts of brass in order for that piece to bend. So for a really thick piece like this, you would need a gap of about that far. As far as the measurements go, that's about 1/2 inch. And the diameter of this lead wire is roughly 1/8 inch. So with that in mind, why are the gaps important between the two parts? The major reason is because the further apart the gap is between the joints, let's say we have wire which has a gap of this far, you can bend that piece of wire back and forth a lot more times than this, because if it was that narrow of a gap and you bent it back and forth a lot of times, that piece would break only after maybe 10 bends back and forth. So that shortens the lifespan of your armature, of course. So you want to always have a wider gap where you can, but you don't want to make it too wide, something like this, because when you bend it, you don't really know where that part's going to bend. It could bend here, or it could just be a gradual curve, as opposed to something like this, which would bend more where you want it to bend. For let's say this is an elbow joint or something, you don't want the elbow to bend at the forearm. So large gaps, they lengthen the life of your armature. Short gaps, what they also do is you can support more weight on a shorter gap like this. So for example, on this puppet here, if I wanted to have all these parts bend, I'd have to have the gap really narrow, so you'd want to use thinner wire than what I've used. But the fact of the matter is that this character here has legs which are too short to actually bend, no matter what. I mean, it's just way too short. And up here I've got the California Raisin reproduction armature, which I built. And this armature here is probably the minimum amount of space between joints and so forth, and the length of the legs are about the minimum for full motion, and that's roughly 3.5 inches long. So anything under 3.5 inches long for an armature using brass tubing and lead wire, chances are will not work. So you might say, well, that sounds kind of weird, you know, Wolverton Productions, they made the California Raisins and the Noid and everything, and you know, they probably figured out a way to solve that problem. Well, I've got an original Noid, and you'll see here. Now this piece of brass tubing I put here just to support the character, but this leg was missing, and you can see this is an entire leg. And they came up against the same problem where adding any sort of hard jointed areas in between the ankle, the knee, and the hips, that wasn't done because they realized this character's legs are too short to withstand any kind of bending in those areas. So if you had added those hardened areas, like a piece of brass tubing just to make it so this part doesn't bend for the lower leg, and a part for the upper leg, the gap would be so small you just couldn't possibly bend it. But what are the other options if you want to make a character walk around, or let's say you want to have the camera on a character's upper body while he's climbing up something, or anything like that, where you think that the legs would be part of the shot. Well, you can make replacement legs. You can have a plug-in system where we've got some brass tubing plugging into the hip area here like this, and you can make replacement legs at all the different angles. And that's something that's been done before, where an entire lower body is replaced with a different pose of the legs, for each pose that you would use while animating. So here I've got a zombie sculpture, and he's got a brass tubing and lead wire armature inside of him, and he's got a detachable head, because the shot that I animated, I had his head fly off, so it just plugs in and unplugs. I've also got a plug-in system for his lower body, where a piece of tubing can plug into him, and he sticks like that. So what does this do for me? If I want this character to appear as he's running, get this. Let's say he's running from over here, or walking, or doing what zombies do best. You can see that you can convincingly make him look like he's walking, even if he has no legs. So this simple base that he's on, which is just a piece of wood with a piece of brass tubing, and it's connected to the wood, and I can move him around, and slide the wood around. That's about the most basic way to make a character appear as though he's walking, by simply zooming in on the upper part of his body. And since he has a plug-in system, he can also move up and down, and he can be adjusted that way. And right here you'll see I have a little a set screw. If I want to adjust him in an up and down position for animation, I can move him up like this and tighten the set screw, which should hopefully tighten him and hold him into place. And there you have it. And that's a really basic way to make him look like he's moving up and down while your camera is up on his upper body like this. We have 2 feet, which we created obviously, and we know the limits of the legs and how far we can make them move, and you really can't move them very far at all. We can pretty much only make these legs straight and focus on the upper body. So the way that we can have more options in animation is to make sure that these legs can be detached, and we can plug in a rig just like the zombie's on, and that way we can always zoom in on the character's upper body that we created, make him look like he's moving around, and just change the camera angles instead of physically changing and replacing the legs. So we know that the height of these legs needs to be somewhere around what I have here, and so we'll work on the next area which is the pelvis, this area on our puppet. And we had to devise a way to make these legs connect, and that area that we create also has to connect to the spine, which will go up and hold the rest of the body. So we'll need about 1, 2, 3 pieces of tubing. The center piece will be for the center piece of wire that goes for his spine, and the 2 legs that connect to the center area. Okay, it's time to cut the next piece, and this here is going to be the part that attaches the spine to the pelvis, and I'm going to use this cutoff wheel. And it's attached to the Dremel, and I'm just going to start by turning it on and getting to it here. Okay. And that's another way to cut these out. And it leaves a pretty nice edge too. Probably the nicest edge out of all the different methods. And as always, you just clean it up with your file. Just like this. Okay. Okay, so what do we have going on here? I cut out some pieces. This is the last piece I just cut out right here. And I have 3 pieces, 2 for the legs, and 1 for where the spine attaches to the pelvis. And this here is just the brass nut with the 440 threaded hole in the center. And so these will all sit like this, all together. And in between here and here I'll add some lead wire. And the spine will go into here and plug in. Okay, so it's time to drill a hole into our square piece, which the threaded brass nut will sit on top of. And one of these little set screws will go through the nut and then through this piece of brass after the hole's been drilled through it, and it will tighten down on the piece that slips inside of it. So, first thing you want to do is turn on your drill press, of course, and when you start to drill through, you don't want to press hard at all. You want to let the drill do all the work. So nice and slow. Now you can see we got a nice hole. And on the inside, you'll notice that sort of indented part broke off instead of being cut. So you can take like an X-Acto knife or any sort of small pointed tool like this and just clean that up. Get that piece to break off the inside there. And you can see it's fairly clean now. And then we want to test this to see if we can push our part through. You can see it stops before it gets through the hole. So generally you can wiggle it through, and brass is soft enough to where any sort of imperfections that are stopping it from pushing through will sometimes correct themselves. And that's not the case here. So what are we going to do now? The best thing to do is just take an X-Acto knife, just get on the inside there and break off any little flashing along the inside if you can, being careful not to cut yourself. Just keep working at it. I'll try this again, see how it works. You see it fits right in there. It's right through. And so, when we solder our nut, the set screw will go right through this piece. And of course that's what we want. Okay, so now we got to solder all these parts together, and that's going to be a really tricky job to do here. We've got 5 pieces total that all have to stick to each other exactly where we want them, and it also has to be strong when it's done. So here you can see we've got this one large brass piece, and we want solder to essentially cover the entire bottom. And so what we do with that is we want to put some flux all over the surface. This will take maybe 3 or 4 drops to do here. Just enough to get this thing coated. You want to avoid putting too much, because when you set this all up, there's a chance that if you have too much flux, it'll boil to the point where it'll disrupt all your pieces. So that's a good coating there. Gonna start laying all these parts on here. I also want to mention that I took some 600 grit sandpaper and scuffed up all these parts as well where they're going to connect, just to make them nice and rough. And I'm going to start with just these 3 pieces here. I'm really trying to do my best to line these up. And I want the areas that are going to connect the legs to flare out somewhat towards the bottom. And now I'm going to try and take some small bits of solder, drop them in there. There's one. Oops. There's the second piece. Now when this stuff starts to melt, I can reposition this if I need to. That looks pretty good. And I take my little part there and remove it. I'm going to start to heat this up. Moving the torch constantly so that no part of this metal will hopefully be hotter than the rest. It'll all sort of heat up at the same time. You see it, the flux started to boil a bit here, and the parts are kind of bouncing a bit. And that'll settle down once it really starts to get hot. And never touch this with your fingers. Always use a X-Acto knife or something metal to heat your parts. And we got some melting of our solder now. Making sure I get a nice even coverage of heat. Now it's still hot enough to reposition. So I tried to reposition it, but I wasn't successful. It's off by a little bit, so I'm gonna start my flame back up here. And just heat this up a little. Won't take much. Just gonna reposition things. That looks pretty good. I'm gonna take some pliers, so I'm gonna blow on it. Cool that off. Okay, so these three parts are soldered perfectly. Those are where I want them. And now I have to solder our final piece right over this hole. And this is going to be the hardest part because we don't want any solder to flow into these grooves or the threads of this nut, because we want that the set screw to go right through, and if there's any solder at all inside there, you won't be able to screw that part through. So I'm going to take some more flux. First I'll scuff this up a bit with some sandpaper. And apply just a drop or so of flux right around that edge. Then, just like before, just take a piece of solder, carefully just lay that right there on the edge. And do the same to the back side here. Start my flame up. Carefully heat this. Okay. I don't know if you saw that or not, but the flux on the back side here just flowed right underneath our part. So I know I got a good connection. Okay, so we'll cool this off and quench it. Okay. Dry our part off. And there we have it. And this should be solid enough to pretty much take any kind of abuse. When a surface area as large as this is covered with solder underneath all these parts, pretty much nothing's ever going to come off. I cut some wire here, some lead wire, and I dry fit all the parts just to see how they'll look. So what we have is we have our set screw, our hex wrench, the part which will plug in and attach the spine to the pelvis. This will fit in there. And we got these legs. And I just want to demonstrate attaching our set screw. So you can see this part will slip in. And when we screw in our set screw, it will tighten down on that brass piece. And hold it in place. Now you'll notice the lead wire, of course, is round. And it'll spin freely in a square socket. And so the way to stop that from happening is to just smack it a few times with the hammer. Put that in, and it's nice and secure. Somewhere about right there. I'll mark the top with the pen. Cut that wire right where that mark is. Now I don't recommend actually filing or sanding these lead parts, because lead is toxic, and when you start to file on it and shave on it and you get all these little bits, it can spread it around your house really easily. So if you have kids or anything like that, you want to make sure that they're not getting that on their clothes or on their fingers and putting it in their mouths or anything like that. So you want to just take your little pieces and put them in a special container or something like that, and just keep them out of the way. And never drill or saw on this stuff if possible. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing with these pieces. I'm just going to flatten these ends out. See how that works. Okay, so we got a couple of legs here. What we'll do next is we'll take some 5-minute epoxy, and this is some Loctite quick-set epoxy, and I got this in the hardware store. Okay, so I'm taking the two parts of epoxy and mixing them together. This is a spine piece. Just going to apply some to the outside with the lead wire. Press that in. So it's pretty snug. Maybe wipe off some of the excess here. That's our first part. I'll apply some to the leg pieces. Push that in. Take the next piece. Apply some more epoxy. That piece in. Now coat the inside of the brass pieces here. This stuff here sets up pretty quick, so you want to work really fast. Just push the feet in. This one. And wait for that to set up. Okay, let this epoxy harden. Actually, it's a day later, so this epoxy is really good and strong. And you can see here we have our nut facing in the front of the character, and there's a reason for this. When you attach a nut in such a way where you have to remove a part, you have to have access to that nut. And the way to do this is look at your design. In our design here we have a belt, and it has a small buckle, and I'm planning on making the buckle removable so that I can take my little hex wrench, stick it through the clay, and have access to that point so I can remove the legs from the spine. So how am I going to do this? What I plan to do is I'm going to take this aluminum tubing and place it over this like that, and sculpt clay around it so that when I remove the tube, there's going to be a tunnel that will lead directly to that spot. So that's just something I wanted to mention. And when we add the next part, what I plan to do is have the nut facing the rear, so instead of having a hole somewhere in the neck area in the front, I'll be able to remove the head if I want to from the back. I made some new parts in order to connect all these areas. We have to connect the spine, the arms, and the neck all together. And the thing I want to mention is when you're drilling through a piece of square brass tubing, the common logic is to take a center punch and tap right onto the metal to make an indentation. And if you make an indentation on a tubing like this, what's going to happen is you're going to actually dent that piece of metal inwards, and if you're sliding parts through, that dent will cause a problem, because even after you've drilled it out, all that metal around it is going to sag slightly inwards. So if that happens, you have a real tough time sliding telescoping pieces on the inside or lead wire. So I kind of, the way that I get around that is just to center the part on the drill as best I can and drill really slow. On this piece you can see it's slightly off center. The hole's not completely centered, but that tube is going to be nice and straight, which is more important than having a centered hole. So let's talk about the parts that I made. I've got several parts. You can see here I have the nut and a part that will be where the shoulders are. And so what's going on here exactly? Let's see. I had to try to figure out how I was going to fit all of these connections into a small area. So on this drawing you can see I've got the arms and the spine and the neck all connected into an area that's maybe 1.5 inches tall by not even 1 inch wide. And so I've come up with a solution where I had to have the arms connected at this little area, and I want the head to be removable. And so how was I going to fit all of these square brass tubing pieces on one small piece of space, which I've made out of this square piece here. So what I did is I took the square tubing and I cut a notch, as you can see, so that the square piece of stock here, this flat stock, could fit into the tubing. And what that'll do is, I don't have any solder at all on this joint, but it's very strong, and these parts can all be really close together and fit into that small space. Now the tool I used to make the grooves was this Dremel cutting wheel, and I just went in there and I put my tubing in the vise and just cut it like this. Made sure it was wide enough so that it would accept the flat stock, and just pushed them in all together, and it fits really nice. So we're going to solder all these together, but first we have to decide before we do this, do we want this character to fly or jump or do anything where his legs are attached to his body? So we're going to take a look at some of these original armatures, which were sent to me by Webster Colcord from Wolverton Studios. And these characters have extra areas which don't seem to make too much sense unless you know what the areas are for. And on this one you can see there's a square piece, an extra one, right under the armpit there. And here you can see a square piece sticking out. And it uses the same system of a set screw in the top, the nut, and a square piece. The same on this armature. You see here. And so these areas, what they're for, are so that you can plug in a piece of tubing, like this piece, and then from behind the puppet you can lift that character if your piece of tubing is connected to a rig. What I've got here is just such a rig. And this here is meant to move up and down by tightening and loosening this part here. And we can also take a hex screw and loosen this area here so that the whole thing can spin. And then I've added on a ball and socket armature type piece. And this rig was specifically made for a character which was climbing something, and so it had to move up and down. And the end piece here is a square piece of tubing, and so I can take this piece and bend it like this on my rig and attach this whole entire piece to my set and plug in a character here and then move it in any direction. And this rig can hold the entire weight of the puppet. And if I had to, I could remove this rig after I've done my animation using a paint program. So something like Adobe Photoshop is a good program for removing rigs, and Painter is also another popular program which I've never used, but it's really popular as far as the really expensive, high-quality graphics packages. And so this is just a simple rig. Just as an example, I've got one of these armatures here, which you can see would plug into that brass piece on the rig, and it can be tightened down at that set screw area here, which can put force on the tubing that goes through it and hold it in place. So do we want to do that with the character we have now? And the answer is, I don't think so. But it's something to think about when you get to this stage. If you haven't physically drawn your character on a blueprint and you're just using a rough sketch like I like to do, you can always figure out, do I want this character to do something later on? And if so, think of it now, because you can still slip those kinds of parts onto your brass tubing that is the spine. So, like I said, I don't really want to do that. I just want to make this character the way he is. And the next step will be to attach all these parts together with solder in the same way I mentioned before. So I epoxied our part on, and I inserted a piece of wire here through the back, and you can see here I've got a piece of lead wire attached to a piece of brass tubing which fits into this piece here, which we attached so his head can be removed. And so I haven't epoxied these in yet. I wanted to mention that on this piece here I flattened the end of this wire out so that as it goes into the tubing, it fits really snug and won't twist inside there. And I'll epoxy that. And for the arms, I've got one long piece of wire, and this piece is also the same diameter for the neck. So what are the diameters of these wires? I read them off before. The thinner wire is 0.125 inches, and the thicker wire is 0.185 inches. And I've got some medium wire, which is 0.70 inches. So that turns out that, let's see, so for the legs it's actually 3/16 of an inch, and for the arms and the neck that's 3/32 of an inch. So I'm going to take this part and epoxy that. And for the arms, I'm going to determine the middle of this piece of wire, and then I'm going to crimp it and pull it out. Fits in right there. And I'll just take these pliers and I'll crimp it so it's slightly flattened. And when I slip it back into the square piece right there, it won't twist. And when I slide this in, I'll just place a drop of epoxy where that crimped part is, push it all the way in so that the epoxy is inside the tubing, and then wait for it to set up. And that's what we'll do next. Okay, our epoxy set up, and I installed our piece here so the head can be removed. It fits into the socket just like this, and I tighten down that set screw so it's really strong. So what do we do next? I'm going to make the head next, and as you can see, what I've done is I just laid the armature on this piece of paper, which is to scale, and that's how I've made all my measurements. And the head, the part that I want made from wood, put a piece of wood side by side. Now what I'm going to do is just roughly transfer these dimensions onto this piece of wood. Just like this. Next thing I'll do is I'll cut this out on the bandsaw. So to get this shape to where I want it, I can simply take some hand files. Start with the rough hand file first. And just keep working at it. Or you can use this attachment, which is the sanding wheel on our Dremel, and just go at it like this. So now I have our piece of wood, which I sanded down, and this will be the skull part of the armature for this puppet. And what this will do is it'll allow the clay to stick to something, so when I turn the head, the whole entire piece of lead wire turns. And if I didn't have this piece of wood in here and just had clay for a head, and you turned the head, it would just slip right off of this piece of wire. So this gives the clay something to stick to. And what we need to do next is we need to trim our piece of lead wire to somewhere around here. And I'll need to drill a hole the same diameter of the piece of wire through the bottom part of this piece of wood. Okay, so I created some more pieces for our armature. The next piece that is the most important are the hands. And the hands here I made out of loops of wire, and this wire is just the same solder I used to solder the parts together. And a lot of people think that solder is not the best way to go, mainly because it has a low threshold for breakage. So when you bend it, you can only bend it so many times before it breaks. But as far as hands go, hands don't last very long when you animate. And one of the main reasons that we make the hands removable, so these parts will fit together, where I'll insert this end piece into our square brass tubing, which will fit into this socket here, and so the hand can be pulled out. And the reason for this is because hands, like I say, don't last very long. You can see a hand which went through one shot, which got kind of dinged up. It's not in too bad of a shape. Here's a character which I animated for 3 shots, and he had to go through, turn him around here so you can see. The whole shot consisted of taking this telescope here, picking it up, and hitting a zombie over the head. And his hand, you can see, is in pretty poor shape. So in general, with hands, they don't last very long. And at this stage, this hand could be resculpted, but it's pretty much useless to resculpt it. And I use the same system where the hands can come out, and I can replace this hand if I wanted to. And I used the same lead wire inside there in the same configuration. So it's kind of like this on the inside. And it lasted really well. This hand didn't break or anything like that, so I know that this system works really well. And one of the things that I found with the original California Raisin puppets was that they used 1/16 inch gauge aluminum wire, and I reproduced this armature as well as I could using the same diameter pieces and whatnot. And I find that aluminum wire like this is actually too stiff for hands, and when you try to bend it, you end up really crushing the clay to move your hand in a separate pose, or a different pose for each frame. so the reason we want to work on the hands next is because when you make them, you want to make sure you have somewhere around 1/4 of an inch, and I eyeball it, so I didn't know the measurement, but 1/4 of an inch between where the hand is and where the connection starts. Let's see. So this area right in here, about 1/4 of an inch. And that gives enough area for the wrist to bend. And this part is just a loop of the wire. And that's about 1/2 an inch around. And I determined that size by putting it on our drawing. And just laying it on there and seeing about how big that's going to be. So there's not much to it. There's pretty much just sitting your wire on top of a drawing like this, which is to scale, and judging to your best abilities as to how big you want that loop to be. Okay, so I epoxied our solder hands into one of these small brass pieces here, and that piece I need to fit into this piece here. So as soon as this hand gets really out of shape when there's clay on it, it's just a matter of making a new one of these solder pieces and just popping it back in there. So replacement hands are very common in clay animation. Not so much really with foam puppets. You don't really need to make a replacement hand, because once the hand is broken, you'd have to almost replace the entire arm, unfortunately, with foam. But with clay, once that hand gets messed up, it's just a matter of popping it out and replacing it with a fresh one. And since hands you use a lot for expression and puppets and so forth, and the hand is constantly moving, when you replace a hand during a scene, and if you're halfway through it, it doesn't matter as much as something like, a torso or a leg or something, because the hand is always in motion. So this part here is kind of tricky, because the way we're going to figure out the length of this lead piece here is we need to line up our hand here with the hand on our sketch, and the whole hand isn't actually drawn. So it would look something like this here, roughly. There's his thumb, as you can see there. So we'll lay that right there where we want it to be. And I'll line up his shoulder here. Make sure that that's lined up. Okay, and so this piece has to fit at the end of that piece, so that when we plug it in, it will be halfway up here in this brass piece here, and the other half will be for the lead wire to be epoxied into this piece. So the place to cut this lead piece will be halfway here, like that, which I'll do now. Just cut that off. So that will fit halfway on there. That piece will be like this. And that makes up the arm. So what I'll do now is I'll just straighten these pieces of wire out. And then I can take and measure this with a pair of calipers like these, and I'll just take a measurement, and then I'll transfer that same measurement to the other side, like this. And you can do this with the tape measure or a ruler or any way you like, really. This is just one way you can do it. So I'll mark it. I'll cut it. And so I know that these two arms are the same exact size. We'll take some pliers and just crimp these ends just a little bit so that they're more snug in the square brass pieces. So you want to squeeze it just enough so that your brass piece doesn't spin. The last part is to just put a couple of drops of epoxy to make sure those parts don't come off on the ends. And there you have it. Now this kind of an armature can also be used in a foam cast puppet. You can take a mold of a character and cast foam latex around this. If you do, though, you'll have a problem where any exposed brass pieces which touch your foam latex will inhibit the curing somewhat. I've heard it doesn't actually inhibit the curing too bad, and you'll still be able to use the foam, but your foam will become blackened, and you won't be able to paint it because paint won't adhere to whatever happens with the chemical reaction. So the way to solve that problem is to simply make sure that you have some junk set screws inserted in these brass nuts, and so you want to remove the good ones, put in some junk ones, maybe they're rusted or something. Spray paint the whole thing with an enamel paint, enamel spray paint like a Krylon or any enamel paint will work. And then remove the set screws, let the spray paint dry, insert new set screws, because if you don't, otherwise the enamel, when it dries, will get stuck in there permanently. Put in some fresh ones when the paint dries so there's no exposed brass areas, and you can cast it that way and it'll work just perfectly. Alright, I'm gonna test out to see how well our tie-down system works. If you remember, we took and we drilled the two holes, the small holes in his feet, and used a 440 tap to thread the brass to accept a threaded rod, which has these this screw, this thumb screw, and it goes up and down. And the way this works during animation is you put the threaded rod through the bottom. Alright, so you can see we got our threaded rod sticking up through here. And you set that right on there. See if we can get it started. Okay, you can see the threaded rod coming through, and you want to tighten the thumb screw so that it pulls down on the puppet. And as you can see now, I can move this. I can move this puppet around, and you can see that foot is firmly planted. It does not move at all. You see there. So it's a very strong system for animation, and so we know that that works. And of course the other options we have, because we drilled the larger holes, is to simply take a wood screw and put it right through there, and to screw it to the set, which is really simple to do as well, except you have to do it from the top. And in that case, we sell these on the website. It's just a hex head cap screw and a hex wrench, and you drill a hole through your most likely you'll use an MDF medium density fiberboard piece of wood for the set top, and then you drill using a 9/64 drill bit into the set, and simply screw this down in there until it goes all the way down and holds your foot in place. And if you do this, of course, you have to have the shoe has to be removable, so you can have access to that as well, which isn't always the best idea. But for characters that are maybe stylized or basic, or you don't mind the extra work, the system is actually the best way to go, because you won't hit your character.